So how do you reckon sports journalists should approach being impartial and impartiality in this digital age?
I think you have to be careful on what you say, especially in my job. It's a bit different because obviously you're working for a club, so you're not really that impartial. But when it comes to like when you're writing match reports and stuff, you don't want to be given too much praise to the away opposition if you're working for a club because it might look badly on your fans looking at stuff thinking why are the club accounts praising other teams when you work for us, for example. So I think it's trying to find that balance of not reporting it wrong, but also you're working for that club, so you're at the end of the day they're paying your wage, so you should be kind of on their side when it comes to things.
Stepping away from a club media perspective, if you're working for an independent source such as the Telegraph, for example, how important is it to be impartial as a written independent member of the media?
Oh, it's a lot more important because when you're working for the Telegraph, for example, say you went to a match or you're at a sporting event, you should be impartial to every competitor in that match at the end of the day because you're not writing for any benefit to anyone or covering someone just for the sake of that. You're doing it. You're doing it because you're just reporting facts and what's happening. You shouldn't be, whether it comes to race, creed, gender, any discrimination, you should be reporting on what's happening. That's the end of the day.
Yeah, so recently Ofcom have said about relaxing some of their rules on impartiality, and obviously Ofcom are the broadcast regulators in the UK. Do you reckon those rules should be relaxed? Should people be able to interpret any media they want from a biased point of view, or should we keep unbiased as the top standard?
I think as a journalist, you have to keep your biases to yourself. You obviously, every journalist, for example, in the world, I'm sure, has certain things that they support or beliefs they have, but I think that should be set aside when it comes to reporting on something because you're doing a job, you're covering news or sport for somebody else to read. It's not just for people that have your mindset, for example. Just because you work in the Telegraph doesn't mean someone from a different race or religion or discriminative or creed should be not reading it. You have to cater for all the audience at the end of the day.
Yeah, do you reckon putting your bias out there? So Henry Winter is a known Chelsea fan. If he puts his bias out on Twitter, does that make his sources less credible when it coming to talking about Chelsea?
But yeah, I think journalists, when it comes to their social media, have to be careful. I think it's a bit like the referee one where it came out about Kut saying about Jurgen Klopp. I think you have to keep your own biases to yourself, especially when you work in such a high industry or a popular industry like football, for example. I think Julian Winter, I think you should just do your job, and yeah, you can support somebody behind closed doors, but on social media you shouldn't be putting out stuff like that.
How much harder is it to be impartial now than it was 100 years ago when the only form of media interpreted by the public was newspapers?
Oh, so much harder. If you want to go on about your daily life on your social media, people are going to see it and see that, for example, you've been to the Anfield to watch Liverpool, so people will just assume then you're a Liverpool fan, for example. It's so much harder nowadays if you want to live your own life, but also have your profession as well. It's 10 times harder.
Yeah, so social media obviously have biases themselves. The platforms do. You see it. You see on X with Elon Musk pushing his own agenda onto the algorithm. How much harder is it now to keep yourself on top of the algorithm, keeping your own stories pushing through as well as keeping them as factually accurate as possible?
Well, maybe not for a club media perspective, but when it comes to I know the Black Book Gazette or local paper, their headlines for SEO, you just have to get some names in it as much as possible because at the end of the day, your article is not going to be read unless it hits certain names or figures that will stand out to people that are going to read it. So I think it's kind of hurting the industry of journalism, I think, because you're not actually reading the content for how good of an article it is. Like somebody could do a nice feature on some hard-hitting news story, but somebody will put Luis Suarez in a title of an article and it'll get 10 times more views just because that's in the title. So I think the whole system's just flawed at the minute.
Yeah, so like you just mentioned with clickbait, how detrimental is clickbait to journalistic values?
I think it's really detrimental. I think nowadays I think people still get in the industry for the right reasons, but once they get in it, they've got pressures from above. They've got people telling them to hit certain viewing figures on articles, and that means that they have to change the ways they've done things. They've been taught in university how to write articles and features and how to intrigue the reader. But then when they get out into the real world and they've got the pressures of their boss trying to hit money figures and stuff, they end up having to go down these clickbait ways.
Yeah, and then finally, so you've obviously worked independently before you worked full time as club media, as Blackpool as a professional. How did you find that switch from writing independently into writing as a club media executive?
Yeah, it is difficult because, as you said, I did like match reports for the rugby paper on Files. That's completely unbiased. So it is hard changing from that to writing a match report where, like, your opening line, you wouldn't be putting, like, oh, Blackpool have lost their 13th game in a row, for example. You'd just be putting Blackpool have lost 2-0 to whatsoever they're playing. So it is completely, as I say, it's quite different. So moving from one to the other is very. So I'd say now, if I work in club media for 3-4 years, I think I'd find it very hard to move out of club media back into independent writing.